Hello, and welcome back to the Anxiety Book Club. This is episode number 48. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Martha Sweezy, author, therapist, and professor at Harvard Medical School. She is the author of this month's book, Internal Family Systems Therapy for Shame and Guilt. So thanks, Martha, for writing this book and agreeing to be on the podcast today.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure.
So one thing that a lot of people don't know about IFS that I think you state pretty clearly from the beginning is this notion of multiplicity. And the quote I have here is, the psyche social system includes numerous separate centers of motivation with different points of view who communicate by way of feelings, sensations, and thoughts. Does that feel like, to skeptics out there or folks who aren't aware of the model, does that feel like a digestible way of kind of explaining this point of view?
I would say the most digestible way for people to get this perspective is to try it out, have the experience. And
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty simple to do. It requires sort of turning your attention inside, noticing a thought, a feeling, or a sensation, and getting curious about it and seeing, sort of asking, what would you like me to know? And then listening, seeing what comes.
Yeah, it kind of makes me wonder, like how, and I know different traditions of Buddhism or mindfulness are more interested in investigation than others, but like how is it the case that for so many folks that have spent so much time sitting on cushions in caves haven't arrived at conclusions similar to folks like you or Dick Schwartz?
That answer is beyond me. I mean, I would assume lots of them have come to the conclusion that they have an inner life that's full of lively activity and that they can listen in and notice. But they also, some traditions, and I'm no expert in this, but some traditions, or many traditions of meditation are like pay attention to it, but don't interact with it. And the difference here with IFS is that we're very much engaging in interaction with these parts.
Yeah, and I guess since IFS or similar kinds of healing work really benefits from having a second person holding the space, it maybe lends itself more to figuring out these kinds of systems than someone just sitting alone meditating.
Well, yeah, and I think the reason that can be for some people is because some of what you're going to come across internally is information or experiences, memories of experiences that were unpleasant or scary. And it's hard to visit those without a sense of backup, basically.
Hmm. Yeah, so to translate that into IFS terms, it'd be something like the parts holding these burdens don't feel connected enough to like the client self, and they need, as you said, backup, someone else in the room.
Well, to be even more explicit, I don't know if everyone who's listening to this is going to understand what we're talking about with IFS, that the assumption is that we're going to find uh, parts being like subpersonalities, and internally, some of whom, when a part has been hurt, or insulted, injured, rejected, in some way hurt, then other parts begin to take on jobs around that hurt part to protect it and contain its negative feelings, its belief that there's something wrong with me, I'm unlovable, I'm worthless, I'm no good. And the parts around the part who feels that way are distracting from that or trying to soothe that in some way. And on top of that kind of configuration of parts being very active, we also have another resource. Everybody has this other resource, which in IFS is called the self. In Buddhism, it might be called the Buddha mind or wise mind, which is a very different sort of center of feelings that are like compassion and curiosity and a whole bunch of other sort of very open-hearted and safe feeling states of being. So when you can access both of those, when you can access that place in yourself that is centered and courageous and curious and compassionate, you can then help parts who are in that place of being afraid and hiding injuries. And so that's the kind of IFS approach to what's going on inside when someone's in distress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for setting some context for us. I think that's important. So I have a ton of questions for you from the book, but I am curious about this intersection between mindfulness and IFS, and I saw you use the phrase loving kindness a couple of times. What kind of background do you have in that tradition?
Um, I mean, I've done a certain amount of reading and a little meditating, but I'm no expert in it, and it's not really been um, my focus.
Okay, I'll
So,
save those questions then for
yeah,
my own daydreaming. Cool. So I think one of the things that really stands out in the book is a seeming novel contribution to the world of IFS, at least to me, is this shame cycle that you split into six parts. Especially this sort of counterintuitive idea that your managers, which in the world of IFS are these protective parts, will take on the job of shaming themselves, not shaming themselves. They themselves are shaming another part, similar to, in some cases, maybe older people in a client's life at the time that um, something difficult happened. Can you speak a little bit about the shame cycle as you describe it in the book? Yeah.
sure. The shame cycle, and I got this from years of inquiring with patients into clients into their internal experience and my own internal inquiries. And it became clear to me that when an when an external, mostly this begins with some kind of external injury, and the external injury can include an illness or an accident, but usually it's interpersonal, and none of us get through childhood without bumps in the road. Sometimes they're very big bumps, and a child has been terrorized or misused in some way. But even if that's not the case, we all have circumstances where somebody is being a pretty big challenge, and somebody is saying, it could be a peer, could be an adult, could be a sibling, is in some way engaged in a power struggle with you, engages you in a way that is a put down, and tries to get power over you with with some kind of insult to who you are, and not what you did, but who you are. You are to this, you are to that. You're not enough this, you're not enough that. And it's a way for that person who's engaging in that behavior to feel bigger and more powerful than the child who is the target of this behavior. But the child who is targeted with that behavior may be vulnerable to it and may not be, but we're always vulnerable to something, so something's going to land somewhere along the way. um, if I have big feet and my sister or brother tease me about that, if I don't mind having big feet, it's fine. It's not going to be particularly injuring. But if I do feel that having big feet is in some way shameful, and I'm being caught out with some defect, and they've noticed it, then I'm going to have a part who feels injured about my body, and that way who begins to want to hide my big feet, and other parts who begin to come in and distract from the feeling of I'm not good enough, because it's hard to go on with life if you feel you're not good enough. So the what we call the protective system of parts who kind of volunteer to step into these roles to as saviors, basically, to keep life moving along and make life bearable. Those protectors, some of them are proactive; they jump in right away, and those, what you were just calling managers, those parts are often critics. I've spoken to large groups of people, and I'll say, how many people in this room have an inner critic? And everybody raises their hand. So it's a ubiquitous uh, experience. Having, it can be mild, it can be very severe, but some parts who are in there who are trying to, get you into shape so that you're lovable, acceptable, included in socially, and that you do what you have to do to function in life. And we need our managers, but we don't need them to be harsh. And if they feel there's a part of you that endangers the whole system, they will begin to be quite harsh often with that part. If only you were this, or if only you didn't do that, or why don't you shut up, or why don't you improve? So they get to work with this project of hiding and improving these supposed defects so that you are socially acceptable. And that's a lot of inhibition. And response to all that inhibition, which often comes in the form of shaming internally, um, which has been in response to an external experience of having been shamed, there's a cycle that gets going. The first two kind of elements chronologically in that cycle are the the interaction or experience that caused this insult to land and stick internally, and so that's the receptivity or the vulnerability to it, and the experience itself, and then this cycle of protective parts who get going with their various actions of trying to handle that information. And there are proactive protectors who are critical and judgmental and do a lot of shaming, and there are also proactive protectors who try to watch out. I call them scout parts. They kind of watch out for future situations in which it could happen again. So they're very inhibiting also. They'll say, don't do this, don't do that, do be this, don't do that, So they're very active in terms of warning. And with all that inhibition that goes on, it's dangerous in the long run. It can actually lead to a suicide part. Uh, Showing up and saying, well, I can help with this. If this is unbearable, if it's unbearable being you, and you're not going to be acceptable, then I've got a way out of this. And there are other parts who, of course, don't want that, and they are more disinhibited, and they will come in with a different kind of solution. Well, if the critic has been blasting you all day and you get home from school or work or whatever, you're an adult, there's a part of say, just have a drink, we have another drink, or eat a gummy, or turn the TV on and get some food and start eating and watch TV. And so, there are these parts who are more disinhibited, who start to try to balance out all that inhibition and harshness with distractions and things that are soothing in the very short run, that work extremely well to turn off the critic. And those things, of course, become costly if they become extreme over time, and then that just ramps up the critic on the other side of it again, and you get into a sort of infinity eight cycle where the the uh, the critical team, the proactive critical team, is motivating a reactive, disinhibited team, which motivates the critical team, and they're kind of stuck in a cycle. And on top of the sort of possibility of this internal infinity cycle going on, there's also uh, almost inevitably a part who may be quite hidden most of the time, but who will come out at some point, who's also reactive and disinhibited, who will take it out on other people.
Hmm.
And that part is a part who kind of tosses the hot potato and says, no, you're the one who's shameful, not me. And adults do that with children, spouses do it with each other, partners do it with each other often. People in positions of authority are at risk of doing this with people who they have power over. So it's a big temptation for protective parts to keep it moving, keep that, and in that way, shame becomes a verb. It's a viral phenomenon that is not just some dark cloud that follows us around and as a kind of a noun. It's always an action. There's shaming, between interpersonal shaming and then shaming inside, which goes out again to the interpersonal field and then gets passed on to somebody else. So it's a phenomenon that puts uh, us all at risk socially as well as internally.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks for taking us through that. So these firefighters that sometimes show up to sort of toss the hot potato of shame outward, can that be understood as a kind of soothing, similar to like the one that might have you watch TV or eat something sweet?
It is a kind of soothing, but it's in that rage and anything, sort of anger and rage that make you feel bigger and more powerful are soothing. It feels safer to be bigger and more powerful rather than weak and shameful, right? So
Hmm.
these parts are coming in with a kind of energetic uh, dose that's the opposite of the energy that goes with feeling shameful, which is a kind of collapse, lack of energy. And so anger and shamefulness, shaming and shamefulness, are two sides of the same coin.
Hmm. So I'm curious, and I know the subtitle of the book or the title is that it's for shame and guilt, but I feel like this maybe describes the entire mechanism of like exiles taking on burdens, but maybe that's not the case. Are there situations in which some traumatized part of us isn't there because they feel not enough or too much or defective in some way?
Well, not in my experience. I mean, well, I will say this: there are sometimes, very occasionally, you come across a part who has been tucked away because the circumstances were dangerous in childhood, and that part is still quite innocent. It's like been put in a bubble, and it's just playing with a toy or something, and it doesn't. It's absolutely unaware of the danger around it. It's been protected in that its innocence has been protected. So those parts, when you find a part like that, that part does not feel there's something wrong with me, but the protectors around it are definitely burdened with that kind of belief. Usually, however, you'll find the message has reached all the way down to the most vulnerable parts of a person's system. And the conclusion those parts came to is, as children do conclude, because they're very self-referential in their way of understanding the world, they conclude, there's something wrong with me that this has happened to me. I am problematic, defective. I have burdened somebody else. I am too much. I am bad. I am evil. Those kinds of beliefs. And they're often told that by, if there's an abusive adult in their sphere, they've often been told that in a very explicit way. This is your fault that I'm behaving this way. You're making me do this.
Hmm. Yeah, I think this finally firmly answers the question for me why children take on these beliefs. And I think you describe in the book why they are so self-referential. But can you remind me? I can't remember if you
Yeah, I
tackle that.
mean, little kids, what do they know? They don't have the perspective that we can get as adults of seeing what motivates other people, and seeing that the behavior, somebody else's behavior, is has to do with what's going on inside of them. It does not. It may be queued up by something I do, but they have a choice about how they behave. Whereas for a child, the children just, for one thing, it allows them to feel a little more control. If it's all about me, then maybe I can do something to change it, or get into control of this. And they make an effort to do that. They try very hard. If life is dangerous, they'll try all kinds of tactics that help them survive, which help in which they're trying to get some control. But the unfortunate side effect of that is that they actually have this belief that they're causing the problem. An example I give in the book is that it comes from the 60s, when there was a blackout in New York City and the subways stopped functioning and there were sirens and everyone was in a panic because this had never happened before. And there was a little boy walking home from school at the same time that the blackout happened. He had a stick and he was hitting the lamp poles, the street lights, with his stick. And then suddenly all the lights in his portion of the city went out. And he went home and he heard all these terrible things that happened, and the grown-ups were all upset. And he believed that he was responsible for killing all the lights in the city by hitting this light with his stick. And he stopped speaking because he was so mortified at the thing he had done. And it took, his parents couldn't figure it out. And they finally took him to a psychologist who got it out of him. And they were able to correct his understanding of things. But he was just a kid. That was his perspective. He did not have the big picture. He wasn't, as I say to my clients, these parts are not playing with a full deck of cards. And they have a limited self-referential perspective, and they try to get some control over things that they can't control by believing that they're responsible for them. And
Mm.
that's one way in which kids get parentified very easily too. If I have a dysfunctioning parent who can't parent me, if I start taking care of that parent, maybe they'll be then able to take care of me. And the child gets drawn into a role of caretaking and role reversal that can be quite startling to witness.
Yeah, that's one of the things on my list I wanted to ask you about. What is the trouble with that, of putting a kid in that position where they have to be responsible for an adult's happiness or well-being or
Yeah. What is not the trouble with that would be the apt question.
okay.
uh, Kids are not adults. They're not supposed to be taking care of adults, and they can't do it. And they don't have the authority. They don't have the cognition. They don't have the power, they don't have the money, they don't have anything. They're just little kids who are supposed to be exploring the world and playing and being held in an environment that's safe enough so that they can be curious and learn and find out who they are and what their interests are. And instead, all that gets hijacked by the needy parts of an adult who didn't get parented, who didn't get adequate parenting. And so if it can get quite complicated in that the parent has the nominal caretaker has protective parts who recruit the child to take care of the adult's young parts who are needy. And there's a woman named Karlen Lyons-Ruth, who is a researcher at Harvard, who's done remarkable research. Prospective means she's followed people for years, parent-child pairs who came into her lab repeatedly and were filmed. And there's this interim period between when they're being interviewed. It's like the person would come in with a baby and then come in a few years later again with a kid and a few years later. And there's one video which you can see if she's giving a talk. You can't see it on YouTube. But if you have a chance to hear her talk, it's really worth going to it. There's a child and a mother sitting in this play space, and there are little kid chairs and a table with lots of toys on it. And the mother is sitting at the table, and the child, who's about 5 years old, is standing next to her, handing her toys. And she puts an Etch-a-Sketch in front of her mother and says, "Would you like this? Want to play with this?" And the mother shoves it away and goes, "No." And the child gets another toy and puts it in front of her mother. And the role reversal could not be more glaring.
Is this real? Oh, go. Were you finished with that thought?
Well, just that it doesn't work out well. It doesn't work out well for the child because they have the parentified part who is trying to take care of the mother is too young to do that, of course, and is burdened with this terrible sense of responsibility. And I ought to be able to control this adult who is, of course, not in control of themselves. And so the child, meanwhile, the child is suffering severe neglect because her needs or his needs are not being met, their needs, and they're not really able to meet the caretaker's needs either. So it's a terrible position to be in. And as that person grows up, their caretaker part, their young manager part, wears out eventually. And this is something you'll often see with people who have come to therapy with some kind of trauma history, where they were extremely high functioning, doing great until they hit a wall at some point when something that was just one crisis too far, one thing that was beyond the ability of this young manager part to handle occurred, and there's a collapse, and the person ends up in the hospital or they end up in therapy, and they can't figure out how they went from high functioning to feeling like they can barely get out of bed. And it's because that young manager part just collapses under the weight of adult responsibilities and not understanding the world and trying too hard, working too hard, and gives up. It kind of becomes depressed, and then there's nobody there internally there's no grown up who has taken over as this child grew up, because there was no input. The kid did not have the resources from adults that were taking care of her. And people like that will often say, "I don't even want to brush my teeth. I don't feed myself well." Because there's a very young part who's like, "I need someone to take care of me." Whereas who's going to do that? And there's nobody there. And in IFS, we're saying, actually, there is somebody there. There is an adult in you. There is a what we call a self who has these other resources, and we can bring that person into the picture internally to shore up, to strengthen, and heal this system that has been so distorted by the injuries of other people's needs.
Hmm. Yeah. Thank goodness for the self.
Right, exactly. But it can be a very hard thing for people who haven't experienced that and who've had a lot of trauma to believe that they have the resources themselves, because their parts were so overwhelmed by what happened to them. So it can take time, which is fine. You know.
Yeah. So I'm curious if this notion of parentification is connected to something else that you spend some time on in the book, which is, I don't know if the right word is like the dangers of empathy or the dysfunction of empathy, but how some of our young, maybe exiled parts sort of start empathizing with other people, and I have a note where you I think you write that it can be ironic that some folks who have like similar exiled burdens often kind of won't get along,
Mm-hmm.
because maybe there's like too much empathy going on, or there's that example of the teenager you were working with who suffered similar trauma to her best friend, and so they were kind of getting into it. Can you speak a little bit about empathy?
Yeah, Tanya Singer, who is a compassion researcher in Germany, um, did an MRI study of a monk named Mathieu Ricard, who was a very experienced monk, and he meditated while in the MRI machine. And first, he had empathy. First, he watched a very disturbing film about orphans in Romania, I think it was, and then he empathized with them while in the machine, and she was taking a look at what was going on in his brain. And he empathy is I feel with you, so he joined with their suffering, and which he was very capable of doing, being a highly experienced meditator. And then he switched over to compassion, and he had compassion for them. And compassion, empathy is I feel with you, compassion is I feel for you. So when he switched to compassion, um, actually a completely different part of his brain lit up. So that was a big surprise to everybody. When he was empathizing with pain, the neural pain pathways lit up in his brain. When he was feeling compassion for these children, reward pathways lit up in his brain, so that it was um, it was extremely painful for him to empathize with them, but it was not painful to have compassion for them. He cared about them, he was concerned about them, but he wasn't personally in a lot of pain with that. And and it was therefore more energizing for him to have compassion for these kids than it was to have empathy. So what I see a lot of in when I'm doing IFS therapy is people, say people who have, I've worked with a lot of people who've been very traumatized, and often they have a surprising amount of empathy for adults who were being abusive toward them. So they have a real mixed reaction. They'll have parts who are angry with the person who treated them that way, and they'll also have parts who identify not with the misbehavior, but with the pain that that adult was reacting to internally. So to put that in IFS language, the adult who's misbehaving has exiled parts also who are hurting, who have been injured, and they have a rageful part who is distracting from that pain by picking on this child or in some way exploiting this child. And the child's parts um, are aware, are empathizing at the same time that they're being mistreated. They're actually empathizing with the adult's hurt parts, and so they will get. It's very confusing for the child to both have empathy for the vulnerability and pain of someone who is mistreating them, and to be angry with that person and scared of them. And so, what I talk about in the book is, we're not going to be, that empathy is just something that we do. We're all good at it. Our young parts are particularly empathic, and that's not a bad thing, but it's a very vulnerable thing if they're taking the lead. And what we really want, and what we're doing in IFS therapy, is sort of rearranging the leadership internally, so that this what we call a self, which is this presence internally who leads with compassion, can give some containment to that empathy, and whole, then make sure, if I'm leading with myself, I'm much more capable of being safe in relationships than if I'm leading with a combination of parts who are empathizing with somebody else's pain, and will put up with their misbehavior as a result, and parts who then also get enraged and angry and lash out as a result of putting up with that misbehavior. So I need if myself is present, I'm much more capable of understanding that the other person is suffering, but not allowing them to behave abusively toward me, to be able to protect myself and call on them to do better than that, or stay away from them, rather than getting in a position where I feel responsible for them because they're suffering.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think in the book there's an example of someone in a relationship whose partner is addicted to something, and the client is having trouble drawing boundaries, perhaps, or sticking up for himself, given that he has this mixture of sort of caretaking or parentified parts that are like working really hard to sort of save this person or help them
Right.
in a kind of unhealthy.
He feels guilty. He has a part who tells him he ought to be rescuing this person, um, at his own expense.
Mhm. One thing that I thought was interesting, just in the tone of the book, is that, and it's probably the case in other places, but there's this notion in IFS of like all parts being welcome, and that's
Mhm.
certainly the case here in this book. But I feel like your attitude towards some of the parts and their shortcomings is like a little more explicit than I've seen in other areas. Like, I guess you mentioned in the book that when you encounter critics, you ask them like how good of a job they're doing, or maybe with some other managers, helping them see the limits of their activity. I wonder if there is any tension there in how we approach parts as sort of being super open and welcome and compassionate versus holding, I don't know, holding their feet to the fire is the right thing to say, but at least being objective about what's working and what's not, like
Mhm.
in a clinical setting.
Well, what I would say is it takes a lot of trust to really welcome these parts, because some of them are threatening. They may be threatening suicide. They may be threatening, uh, in the sense of just doing, just engaging in destructive behaviors, like various extreme addiction behaviors, or eating disorder behaviors, or raging at other people, or whatever. And some of these parts can make it, the reactive, what you would call firefighter parts, which is the name that Dick Schwartz gave to them, because they'll knock down the house to put out the fire, the emotional fire. So these are parts who, the really reactive, extreme parts who who will not cop to caring about consequences. Their goal is to stop that feeling right now, and they'll do whatever they have to do that. So those parts can take some patience and kindness and trust that they actually are trying to help out, and that their motives are good, and that if they're given, if we in therapy can really address their fears and their concerns, that they will not want to be destructive. This is not their goal to be destructive, it's their goal to survive. And if we try to prevent them and vilify them or pathologize them, they with good reason think we don't get it, we don't understand why they're doing what they're doing. So the more we can help our manager parts, who can get scared of these parts, understandably, to step back a little and let us, with our curiosity and compassion and courage, take the lead with these parts, the more they will come forward with us in response. Not, not, they have to know that we're not trying to control them, but that we are genuinely have something to offer that's better than what they're doing. And because what they're doing is really hard and scary, actually. People don't want to die, but often they're engaging in behaviors that will kill them either slowly or quickly. And they don't want that. None of their parts want that. And we have to trust that, and trust that they're good. They mean well. They have good intentions, and they want options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense.
But that's me. That's me helping my parts who get nervous, right? I really have to be able to help my parts. Um, Let me take the lead, because my parts can get pretty nervous if someone's, and of course, if someone says, "I'm when I walk out of here, I'm killing myself," then sometimes I might, it hadn't happened to me, but I might then say, I actually can't let you kill her or him. That's not a good idea. We can do better than that, I promise. And so right now you got to go to the hospital. It doesn't happen that often, but it's certainly a possibility sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed there's a couple occasions, not many, but there's a couple occasions in some of the dialogues where the IFS hat sort of comes off, and then the you being just a person in the world comes on, and you like explain something from
Mhm.
some like reasonable point of view to the client or whomever is listening.
Yeah. But I
So.
guess what I'm saying is that is the IFS, that's still the IFS hat. In other words, being compassionate does not mean being sort of letting a part who's going to be violent towards the person or somebody else just do whatever it wants. That's not compassionate, actually. If you can't make a deal with a part like that because it's so overwrought, then you have to offer some kind of safety and containment. And as I say, if you have a relationship with a person for long enough and you've befriended these parts, you don't get to that place anymore. But I worked, in clinics and hospitals where and I was on call. Someone would come in a big crisis, and I didn't have a relationship with their parts. I didn't. This was actually before I was doing IFS, but I didn't. They didn't know me. I didn't know them. Under those circumstances, it's much harder to make a deal with a part who's in an extreme place. It can be done, but if you know what you're doing, but it may not be possible. In which case, that person needs some help to stay alive, to get to the other side of the crisis, and then be able to do this internal inquiry and help their own parts.
Mhm. It seems like, given that you've done this for quite a while, and you're writing books about it, and that you're very confident in the sessions. Like a lot of times, or some of the time, you'll say to a client when approaching an exile, say something like, "Well, we can help, like help is possible, or what what would you be interested in giving us some space if you knew that like we can take like apply something to this hurt such that you don't have to work so hard. Like I feel like there's a confidence there when you're in the therapy seat that maybe newer practitioners would feel more sheepish about, like not necessarily offering a guarantee but some vision for what's about to happen or what is possible.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of something. It's a paradox you kind of have to live with as you're learning IFS because um, I am very confident now, but I wasn't in the beginning. And so, Dick Schwartz calls this being a hope merchant, but it's harder to be. It's you can't really be a good hope merchant if you don't actually feel it yourself. So, the more experience you have under your belt, the more confident you're going to become. And in the beginning, you're sort of borrowing some confidence. And it may take you longer to kind of negotiate that with parts because parts are hypersensitive to whether that's genuine or not. They need to know that you know what you're doing, not in terms of knowing what their story is or what's important for them, but knowing how things work, how internal systems work. They need to know that you get that.
Speaking of the word work, there's an interesting section of the book where you try to replace that word with something
Mm.
else. I guess especially for clients who are coming in with their managers who are trying to get stuff done. Can you talk a little bit about that
Yeah,
idea?
I mean, I've come, and again, this is, we're not going to manage to banish the word work entirely. I just used it. I could have used the word function just as well. But one of the things that I am mindful about is you replacing the word work with words like inquiry and exploration and checking things out and stuff like that, because we are mostly were engaged with very young parts when we're doing this. Eventually, sometimes they're teenagers, sometimes they're in their 20s or 30s, but often as you work, when you work your way down to the turtle at the bottom of the pile, the yurtle down there at the bottom, it's a young part who got hurt in some way. In terms of their identity, you are something wrong, and that part uh, is a kid and doesn't need to work. We don't need these young parts who are circling around vulnerable parts and around trying to handle injury to be working. We need them to stop working and go play. We need them to feel safe enough to allow the self to come back into the picture and bring those resources in, and have older parts who are perfectly capable of handling a lot of things in life take over, so that you don't have a 5-year-old who's trying to take care of everybody, or an 8-year-old who is trying to uh, whatever, stop you from feeling feelings. So you want to get these little kids off the hook,
Hmm.
and you don't want them working. And so I try to not use the word work about therapy. It's
Mm-hmm.
not work, it's an inquiry. And we have as much playfulness and humor um, and sort of curiosity in our explorations as possible, rather than work. These parts have already been working too long, too hard. They shouldn't be working. We need to get them out of that position.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a lot of different techniques in the book. I mean, there's so much in this book. We certainly won't be able to get to. And I think a single read of it, especially for someone who's trying to practice IFS, would be insufficient. One that sort of caught my eye that I thought was interesting and maybe requires a little bit of time is what is the U-turn? How does that work?
Yeah, the U-turn is a great uh, way of proceeding in therapy. Basically, it's an invitation. When I have a feeling about, if I come in and I say, my boss did X, Y, or Z, and I'm really mad, the invitation there would be not to focus on the boss and the boss's behavior, because A, the boss isn't there to talk about their reasons or motivation, and B, uh, they're not there to be influenced either. So, uh, what we're doing is saying, okay, well, when your boss does that to you, what happens inside of you? And what comes up? Which parts start responding to a situation like that? And how do they respond? And why do they respond that way? And that inquiry leads from protected parts to the vulnerable part who's being protected. So often a kind of reactivity in interpersonal situations is a kind of reigniting of something that uh, comes from earlier experience. And you can use what's happening today as what Dick Schwartz calls a trailhead, and follow that trail down to these very vulnerable parts who, it's kind of like, if you don't take care of those vulnerable parts, you're living in a house where you have children locked in the basement who are crying, lonely, terrified, um, uh, desperate, and you're letting them live down there, and you're not paying any attention to them. You're trying to go about your business while they're in the basement suffering. And there's a cost to that. Ultimately, it's cruel, it's it's disturbing, it gets all these protective parts to start behaving in ways that can be extreme, and even though they mean well, they're very costly behaviors that don't work well anymore when you're an adult. Um, and we're saying, let's get those kids out of the basement. There's nothing wrong with them. They got hurt and they need to be taken care of. And you guys who've been working so hard to distract from them or soothe the body, don't need to do that anymore. There's a grown up here now who can do that, who can take care of this child and love this child. Love is the key here. Compassion and love are sort of hyphenated there. When someone has compassion, they also have love.
Mm. I think you conclude in the book that shame is not useful, and maybe you are anticipating some folks arguing that it is actually sometimes useful, but I think you don't reach that conclusion. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's very fair to say, and it's also fair to say that a lot of other people. There's a big ongoing discussion in the field of mental health, and I'd say out in the world as well, around whether it's important for people to feel ashamed. And in general, I think I'm going against the tide when I say no. It's important for people not to feel ashamed. It's important for people to be able to feel guilty if they have actually transgressed. It's important for people to know the difference between uh, adaptive guilt, which is appropriate guilt. I did wrong, so I have to make a repair, and guilt that is not deserved, where you feel guilty even though you did not transgress. Survivor guilt and separation guilt are two examples of guilt that can arise uh, for parentified children, and people who are growing up in really dysfunctional families, where they feel that in the case of survivor guilt, their happiness and success is at the expense of somebody else, In the case of separation guilt, their pursuit of normal developmental goals is at the expense of somebody else and is a transgression, and it's not, right? So it's really important for people to be able to feel guilty when they've done something wrong, to know when they haven't done something wrong, and to feel I'm okay and I'm lovable, and to never feel that they're unacceptable, or that they're been thrown out of humanity for some feature of who they are that somebody else criticizes. That's just not useful for individuals. I mean, I would say that the feeling of shame is hardwired, as all feelings are, and comes from an evolutionary advantage of being a feeling that causes us to want to comply and stick to the group and not be different. And so that was clearly an evolutionary advantage for our survival as a species. But it's not. Comes at the expense of individuals being exiled for, in some way, not being the same as others in the group, and that actually is not useful for the individual, and it's not useful for us at this point in time, at an evolutionary time, in my view, to be keeping those kinds of severe boundaries by kicking people out or othering different groups who are different, because we're very much more interactive in the world now. It's a small world, and we have to learn to be inclusive rather than exclusive if we want to
Mm-hmm.
survive.
Mm. Yes.
So shame is not useful in my view. Compassion is the opposite of shame, and compassion is something that everybody has the ability to access.
Mm-hmm. Well, Martha, I see that we're getting close to the top of the hour, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time, although I do have many, many questions here. Is there something I haven't asked that you think is important to leave the audience with?
Oh boy. I can't think of anything. I mean, there's a lot. The book says a lot, right? And I really thank you for being interested in it and asking questions about it. It took me sort of 30 years to write it, in the sense
Mm.
that it was from the beginning of my career to when I felt I could articulate all this, that I was uh, trying to figure out what was going on and what makes us tick. And when I got to the place where I thought I understood that, I wanted to write it down. So this book is speaks of my journey through years of having the privilege of being sort of guided by people into their internal lives, and seeing what makes me tick and them tick, and what we all have uh, um, in common.
Mm. Well, it's truly packed full of information. There's just so much in here. It's a tome for sure. Thank you for spending some time with us today, and
Sure.
for the
My
work that you've
pleasure.
done.
Yeah, thank you.